All right, in the last video, we talked about how a new middle class was developing, new ideas and more time to think. Well, let's move into the next section, what they're thinking about and talking about. We're going to split this up into two different videos. One, we're going to talk about social changes, and then we'll talk about art changes in the next video. All right, so first, we start to see some liberal reforms. Remember, liberal just meaning change. We're going to see some changes, reforms. We're trying to fix some problems. So changes going on in Europe, late 19th century. All right. The early 19th century, late 18th century, we saw political revolutions. We saw the American Revolution, we saw the French Revolution, and we'll talk about Latin American revolutions later. So the early 19th century was chaotic and violent. The reign of terror. A lot of people died. So, towards the end of the late 19th century, some people, in Europe mainly, started to talk about new ideas. Maybe we needed to make some changes. Maybe there needs to be some changes in society to prevent the lower classes from killing the upper classes, like the French Revolution. Also, remember, there's way more poor people out there in the world, and if we're treating them terribly, like the early industrial age, the early factory age, if we're treating these people so horrendously, eventually they're going to hit a point where they don't care, and they're going to go crazy and wild. So maybe we should start treating these people better. You're going to start seeing some pushes for reforms. Another thing to consider is England, Germany, France, these countries of Western Europe, they aren't America. The United States of America is a country of immigrants. If you were a German and you didn't like Germany, you would leave the country and come to the United States of America. Most of the people at school, most of your classmates, right, are from different European countries or different parts of the world nowadays, incredibly diverse nowadays, and they all came here for largely the same reason: better opportunities, more freedoms, better economic options. Well, that's always been the case. And so in the 19th century, England, Germany, and France realized pretty early on that if they continued to treat their employees, their lower class peasants, as poorly as they were, these people were going to leave. They were going to go to America. And they didn't have robots. They didn't have artificial intelligence. They needed workers. They need the lower class. So what do they need to do? They need to make some reforms to make their lives more bearable. Otherwise, these people are going to flood out of the country and take their skills with them, their labor, but also their skills, and come to the United States of America. So, what we start to see in European countries, more so than the United States of America, is going to be the development of socialism. Now, that's a hot button word, and you've probably heard that word and probably heard it used incorrectly in many times in your life. But socialism basically is just social programs. Now, people are going to define it in different ways. But in this class, we need to know that there's a difference between socialism and communism. A lot of people use those words interchangeably. That's not a good plan. It's not going to help us in this course. So socialism, though, basically just social programs. That there should be some say in society for the lower class people in concerns healthcare, labor, hours worked, pay, those sort of things. There should be some kind of protections for the old age, rather than just let the free market and basically the factory owners and the richest people and the politicians make all the decisions, that the lower class people should have some say. That's about it in a nutshell. Public schools, that's socialism, right? That is public taxpayer funded social education programs. So that's public schooling. Socialism exists in many different forms. Many countries in Europe, Germany in the 1870s start developing universal health cares. In the 1870s, Germany starts developing a universal healthcare system for all people. You have to understand, though, they aren't doing this to help the poor people because it's the right thing to do. They're doing this so that the poor people don't kill them. That's that's the main reason we start to see a lot of these social reforms. So the poor people don't kill them, or that they don't flee the country coming to the United States of America. Not that the United States of America was 100% perfect. We had the same factory abuses, but we also had more options and more opportunities, more open land. It was seen as the land of opportunity. So Europe starts seeing more liberal reforms. Voting rights are going to hit in Europe before, and for more people than they do in the United States of America. Healthcare, still something the United States of America does not have a universal healthcare program, while the European countries have for over 100 years. Social Security, basically, what we have Social Security now, European for the elderly, that developed in the Great Depression era, the 1930s. That was not a thing in America until the 1930s, but European countries had it before us. Schools are school systems based off of the German model, the Prussian school model. It's during this time period, the idea of educating children. That's all socialism. So This is pushing towards making lives of people better. And next year in APUS, you'll learn about the American labor fights, and like having an 8-hour workday, 8-hour time for play, 8-hour rest. But that all came later. America's fight's gonna be a few decades behind compared to the Europeans. So some people, though, were pushing for even further, and this gets into communism, which you've probably heard about before. We're going to be talking about mainly ideal communism here. Now, at this time period, we're in the 19th century, there's no communist countries, there's no communist revolutions. Those are going to come during the 20th century. Those are going to come in Russia and China and places, Cuba, we'll talk about that later, North Korea. Right now, we're just talking about idealistic conceptual communism, all right? So the very ground floor of it. You've probably heard of Karl Marx, the guy up here with the giant beard. Karl Marx was an economist. He lived in England because he was largely kicked out of Germany, and that goes beyond our class. But he was a complicated guy. He had a lot of personal problems. He cheated on his wife, all sorts of things. Interesting character to look up, but definitely had some rough spots. But anyways, Karl Marx lived in England and saw the horrors of the factory system. He saw, the early industrial age. He witnessed firsthand children out on the street with mangled hands because they had worked on machines. If you force a child to work for 14 hours a day on a complicated machine, their bodies don't grow correctly. Their hands don't grow correctly. They can be deformed. They can be injured. And he saw people on the streets who were losing arms and legs and were begging. He saw dark, dirty slums, and he lived in a lot of these places. He was quite poor for a lot of his life. So he witnessed these abuses firsthand. Then he starts coming up with, reasons why. How did we get here? How did we get to this place? His decision, his conclusion is that capitalism, which we talked about before with Adam Smith and some earlier chapters, his decision was that capitalism was largely at fault because it created classes of people. That there were rich, now middle, increasingly middle, but also a large amount of poor people. And that these classes were basically at war with each other. They were struggling against each other, mainly the rich versus the poor. He said that the Industrial Revolution led to this exploitation of labor, this giant division of labor. There was this big imbalance. His argument was that in history, if you were a blacksmith, you made a horseshoe or something. You made a hinge. You made something. And it took you time, it took you materials, and took your labor, and then you reaped the benefits of that pretty much directly. Well, the industrialization changed all that. Now you are not a skilled artisan. You're not a blacksmith. Now you are just a part of the machine. You're just making sure that the machine works. And you might make 1,000 horseshoes in a day now, maybe even more, but you don't get 1,000 times the benefit from it. Now, there is still benefit being created. There is excess benefit being created, but you, as the worker, are not receiving it. The excess benefit goes to whoever owns the machines. And so if you ever hear somebody talking about the means of production and that sort of stuff, that's what they're talking about. Whoever owns the ability to produce gets the reward. Now remember, the peasants, the lower class people, aren't the factory owners. They couldn't afford the machines. They didn't have the capital. They didn't have the wealth to purchase the factories and purchase the machines. And this meant that they were doing the labor and oftentimes suffering for it, but they weren't getting the benefits. And there's all this new wealth. Some of the richest people to ever live are going to live during this time period, but it's not going to the poor. So there's this giant imbalance. The imbalance has always existed, he argued, but now it's huge. It's exaggerated during the industrial age. He also argued that the upper class, the bourgeoisie class, which we talked about before with the French Revolution, he argued that the bourgeoisie class used the proletariat, the sans-culottes, the lower class peasant people. They used them to overthrow the first and second estates. Hopefully you guys remember that, right? The first and second estates used to have all the power. The third estate included everybody else, the bourgeoisie, the peasants, whatever. He argues that bourgeoisie class used the lower class to get rid of the first and second estate. And then when the first and second were gone, who was left? The bourgeoisie and the peasants. And so the bourgeoisie class took power, and they were now instead of having the church be in charge, and instead of having the nobles be in charge, now it's the business owners. Now it's the rich people who have all the authority and the power. So they basically argued that the lower classes were used and lied to in order to overthrow the ancient regime. So cool, right now he's just basically studying history. Now the next thing he's getting to, though, is he's trying to predict the future. His decision was that one day the working class people, the lowest class, which he calls the proletariat, you may have heard that word before, would rise up and take over the factories from the bourgeoisie. He said that the abuses would be so horrible that eventually the lowest class would rise up and overthrow the people who owned everything, the owning class. And so take back the machines and the production from the bourgeoisie. And then, following this, and this is all him trying to protect the future, he argued that eventually there would be no private property, true equality between people of all people and all genders and all sorts of stuff, and also no capitalism, no competition. Everybody would share. There would be no bosses, no need for government. Everyone would work together for the betterment of society and human society. And he called this communism, like a community of people. So everybody would exist communally. Um, and this is development of basic communist thought. He's trying to predict the future at this point. He also said, and I think we talk about it here in the next slide, but he also said that this was going to happen in countries like Germany and England. It's kind of ironic. The countries that the countries that actually become communist, he would have never thought would have become communist. We'll talk about that later. Just tying in with that, this symbol, which you've probably seen before, the hammer and the sickle, this is not Marxism. This is not Marxist communism. This symbol here we oftentimes associate with communism. It's actually Leninism. This is an evolution. All right, Karl Marx believed that the proletariat was the urban industrial working class, the people suffering in the factories. The sickle, that represents farming labor. Karl Marx did not believe farmers had the ability to understand class struggle, and he also believed that they were separate from this whole struggle and this whole separate system. So this symbol here, and we'll talk more about it later when we get to Leninism in the 20th century, but this symbol here is actually not Marxist communism. It's sort of weird, and we'll talk about it later, but there are different forms of communist thought. A lot of times we group communists all together and say, oh, communism means this. No, Marxist communism is different than Leninist communism, which is different than Stalinistic communism, which is different than Maoist communism, which is different than Castroism. There's all these different forms of communist thought. They're all slightly different. It's actually going to cause some huge divisions. Communist China and Communist Soviet Union, Russia, almost went to war several times in the 20th century. We'll talk about that later. So more Marxist thought stuff. He at first was looking at history. Primitive communism, that's like caveman times, that we all lived together in small clan-based groups and kinship-based societies, shared everything, shared food, shared tools, and this was like everybody sharing and sharing alike. Fairly accurate, probably. We've talked about this before in like the very beginning of the year. Paleolithic society, there was no real concept of wealth because money didn't exist, and it was hard to accumulate large amounts of wealth, and people did share. Trade and bartering and things like that only happened between people who were strangers to each other. So it wouldn't have happened in most clans and family groups. But then, as society grew and developed, we started to see feudalistic societies where probably whoever was strongest took over and became the noble, the lord, and feudalistic societies are going to rule then for thousands of years. Where basically you have an aristocratic system where peasants were the lowest rung, and then you had people who owned them, essentially. That's a feudalistic system. Capitalism is moving into where we are now, industrial capitalism, where you start to see the machines building up, and capitalistic theory, which we already talked about before, evolving finally to socialism, where you start to see some social reforms and worker rights and things like that, which eventually will then turn into communism. And I want to stress this out because socialism and communism are not the same thing. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably. That is incorrect. I think it was Lenin who said that socialism leads to communism. That was how could socialism and communism be the same thing if one leads to the other? So they're not the exact same thing. Anyways, excuse me. Marxist thought believed that history is a series of changes that have been going through in this class struggle, moving from this point to this point, that these periods here are class struggle, where the poor and the rich are at conflict with each other, the rich trying to control the labor of the poor. They also, Marx will put out the belief that religion was used to control the poor. A very famous quote is that religion is the opiate of the masses. Opiates like opium, like unfortunately the opiate crisis we're dealing with in our country today. The idea that it makes you okay with the abuses and the pains that are struggling in society. You go to a religious, it doesn't matter what religion, but you go to a religious service and it makes you feel good, and you believe that even those things are suffering right now and you're struggling right now, that your paradise awaits you in the future. It's a very powerful idea. And so Marx argues that religion is a lie that is used by the rich to control us. Not all communists, by the way, are going to believe this, but many communist countries will ban religion. The Soviet Union, for example, closed all churches and oftentimes repurposed the buildings as warehouses and stuff. We'll talk about that later. So you'll see a lot of communist countries will be atheists, atheist nations, because they believe that religion was just a tool of the capitalists. Next, socialism was a step towards inevitable capitalism. Communism. We already talked about that, and we already talked about what socialism is. Belief that communism will come to highly capitalist societies. This is an important part of Marxist communist thought. Marx believed that Germany and England, these are the countries he was most exposed with, and other countries, France, United States of America, these countries would be the communist world. These countries, with their factories and their large amount of urban workers and factory workers, these would be the countries that would convert to communism. He never believed that countries like China and Russia and Cuba, that these places would be communist. If you told him that, he would laugh at you. Uh, Obviously, he was wrong. Those are the countries that are going to try to create communism, but they are going to have different versions than Marx. Marx would have totally disagreed with Lenin, totally disagreed with Mao, especially, and we'll talk about that. Maoism almost isn't even communism at all. It's a whole other thing. He believed that communism would have come to these highly capitalistic urban societies due to the factory abuses, and the proletariat to him were the urban working class. He was obviously totally wrong with that. Ironically enough, like, they're going to get fascism. If you are a country, and we'll talk more about fascism later, but if you're a country like Germany or England, you are more susceptible to fascist beliefs than communist beliefs. And we'll talk about what fascism is later in the 20th century. Right now, it didn't exist. So there's nobody talking about fascism yet. But countries like Italy and Germany are going to be more prone to fascism when things get bad. Meanwhile, countries like Soviet Union, Russia, and China will become more prone to communism. All right, moving from that. Another big social belief that's going to develop is feminism. This is going to be inspired. We already talked about Mary Wollstonecraft. Other people were talking about women's rights issues. Oftentimes, women's organizations, we talked about this before, were organized around slavery. The slavery, anti-slavery groups, the abolitionist groups, and the women's rights groups were tied together at first. They were largely the same groups of people. Women in Europe and the United States of America started to demand the right to vote and to have more rights just in general. In the United States of America, you may have heard of the Married Women's Property Act. That was the idea, it seems ridiculous today, that a married woman could own property for most of history in America, but also in other countries too. If you were a woman and you had property or you had an inheritance, as soon as you got married, that became your husband's property and you did not have any authority over it. Women start arguing for the right to divorce. That's going to be a long, hard road to toe in many countries. But divorce rights start to become at least something people are talking about, and also child rights. The idea that women would have a say in the upbringing of their children. If there was ever a divorce, oftentimes women would have the children taken from them, and it would go to the male only. It wouldn't even be a question. That was typical. Women were kind of treated like children for most of history, but now we're starting to see women, inspired by Wollstonecraft and other people, arguing for voting rights, property rights, divorce rights, rights to their own children. Things are starting to change for women. This is not an easy change. Most of these are going to be peaceful at first. Most of these protests were women with signs and just trying to pass out pamphlets and try to encourage people to support their cause. However, the early suffragettes, these people are arguing for suffrage, the right to vote, started to just be ignored by society, so they started to get more violent. Many women would go in and physically attack police officers just to make it in the news, essentially, and just to have their cause heard. Because if a woman walks up and punches a police officer in the face, it's probably going to be on the news or be in the newspaper the next day. And people would talk about, like, well, why did they do this? Well, because they're a suffragette. It's maybe not the best attention, but it is attention. Many of these women faced horrible abuses. When they would go to prison, several suffragettes would be locked up in prison cells, and many times they would go on hunger strikes. A hunger strike is a form of, I don't want to say passive resistance, it's active resistance, but it's nonviolent resistance. So women on these hunger strikes would be doing a nonviolent resistance, saying that they, were put in jail for bad causes and their cause is just. And if they let the woman die from starvation in prison, then the society, then the police, then the prison would look like a terrible monster, right? That they're letting women die in prison who are just, so willing to fight for their cause that they're willing to starve themselves to death, for their cause. So, unfortunately, many women suffered through forced feedings. Uh, Oftentimes, what they would do is hold the woman down, or strap her down to a chair, and then put a tube through the nose down into the stomach, and then pour a gruel, basically like an oatmeal, watered down oatmeal mush through the nose tube into the stomach. Apparently, it was agonizing. You would hear screaming, and it's like a horrible torture, but you would not die. So they would refuse to let women die in prison due to starvation. That's pretty horrific. But this is how important it was for these women to fight for their rights, to have a say in society, and not be basically treated like slaves in the home anymore. Another famous suffragette, Emily Davison, you may have heard of this before. She went to a horse race and she ran out in front of the horses to make a big appearance and to fight for her cause and get her cause heard and to promote her ideas. And she was hit by a horse at the horse race. I don't know how fast the horse is going, but the horse plowed into her and she died. Debated whether or not she wanted to be a martyr for the cause. Apparently, she bought a return ticket, like a two-way train ticket to get there. So maybe it was an accident. Maybe she just wanted to run out and make a big splash and have people pay attention to her cause. But she died for it and became sort of a martyr for the feminist movement. So yeah, suffragettes smashed windows, burnt buildings, assaulted police officers, hunger strikes. It's going to take a long time. It starts in the 19th century. During this time period, we see a lot of social and cultural changes. It's going to take a long time to actually have an impact. Early 20th century, though, we start to see women getting the right to vote in England and then eventually the United States of America. We call this sometimes first wave feminism, and we'll talk about later feminist changes more like mid 20th century. It's going to come up again. First wave feminism is considered pretty conservative by today's standards. We're not talking about women getting equal pay or having the ability to work equal jobs. That's not even on the table yet. They're not even considered that. Right now, women are fighting the early first wave feminism. Women are fighting for the right to be considered human beings and to have basic voting rights and property rights. So like just basic humanity. So it's pretty basic by today's standards, pretty conservative. All right, last slide for this video. This is mostly focusing on middle class women. All right, so poorer women would still have to work constantly, but upper and middle class women, we start to see the development of separate spheres, and that's the term that's used. So think like a Venn diagram, right? If you had a Venn diagram, you have two circles and they overlap in the middle, and then there's one side and the other side, they have different qualities. Well, for men and women, there was very little overlap at all. Men worked out in the public. They got to go outside a lot more. They worked outside of the home. Women worked entirely at the home. Middle class women and upper class women didn't need to work. They didn't need to go to work in a factory. Poorer women, of course, would. All right, poorer women didn't have these luxuries, but middle class and upper class women would stay at home, and their job was at the home. Their job was to create a good environment and raise good Christian children. That's the belief. Be friendly, pleasant, polite, and charming. Those were the qualities of a woman at this time period. During this time period, the other idea is this cult of domesticity, almost like a religious belief, but this belief system of women, that women at the domestic life should be perfect in this way, perfectly pious, very religious, very pure, submit entirely to their husband and the will of their husband, be taking care of the home and have a clean, well-decorated home, and of course never work. For a middle class or upper class woman to want a job or have a job would be considered unusual and weird. Women were held to incredibly high standards. And they kind of propagated this as well too. It became part of the culture that women would judge other women for these ideas. If you were a woman and some other middle class woman had a job, you would look down upon her or wanted an education or spoke against her husband. That would have been abhorrent. You would probably isolate that person and remove them from your lives. We start to see a lot of publications and advertisements and magazines essentially targeted towards women, promoting these ideas, the ideas of taking care of the home and decorating your home and dressing nicely for your husband and submitting to your husband. These are the qualities of a middle class woman. Meanwhile, men just had to go work and come home. That was basically the idea. These ideals of the cult of domesticity, of course, though, were uh, detrimental. I mean, obviously, today we look at it and say these set unrealistic standards for women. It's very limiting for women's lives. The idea that you can't have a job and you can't question your husband, these ideas are very limiting. Poorer women were also just entirely cut out of the system. If you were a poorer woman, you looked at the upper class women and the lives that they lived and the clothes that they wore and the houses that they had, and you were cut out of that because poorer women had to work and poorer women couldn't have the perfect home and poorer women didn't have the perfect clothes and the perfect house or anything. So poor women were largely isolated from this. And in the United States of America, immigrants and African American women were largely cut out of the system as well too, and that had a huge emotional and mental impact on people. This whole cult of domesticity idea too, it seems ancient, it seems archaic. We and the idea of separate spheres, these ideas seem ancient to us today, and we're so, well, this is old, and we have women can go to school, and women have more educational rights and working rights. However, we still have a lot of this impact with us to this day. Most families still, statistically, and maybe things are changing, most families, women still do more of the work taking care of the home and the families and the cooking and the cleaning, whereas men don't as often. I think it's probably improved over the years, but it still is an issue in our society today, and it's kind of a legacy of this time period. So in middle class and upper class societies today, women are still largely seen as being the controllers of the home, and men are the breadwinners. This is still kind of a legacy of this, something we're still dealing with as a society.